The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the local park as Ethan leaned against his truck, his eyes fixed on the playground in the distance. His daughter Lily's laughter carried on the breeze, a sound that usually brought joy to his heart. Today, however, it was tinged with an undercurrent of worry. If you love your family and want to listen to amazing and shocking stories, click on subscribe and avoid 20 years of bad luck in your life. Lily was playing with her friends, their small figures darting back and forth across the playground equipment. But it wasn't the children that held Ethan's attention. It was the tall, lean figure of Mr. Harris, the physical education teacher, standing at the edge of the play area. Ethan's jaw clenched involuntarily as he watched Mr. Harris clap and encourage the children. There was something about the man that set Ethan on edge, despite his seemingly friendly demeanor. Perhaps it was the way Lily's eyes lit up when she talked about him, or the fact that he always seemed to be around, filling a role that Ethan felt should be his alone. As he observed the scene, Ethan's mind wandered to his own childhood. He remembered sunny days, much like this one, spent in the backyard of his family home. His mother's voice echoed in his memory, gentle and encouraging. "Always look for the good in people, Ethan," she would say, her eyes crinkling at the corners as she smiled. "The world can be a beautiful place if you let it." Those words had shaped him once upon a time. But now, standing in the shadow of his truck, they felt like relics from another life. His mother was gone, taken too soon by an illness that had ravaged her body, but never dimmed her spirit. Her absence was a constant ache, a void that seemed to grow larger with each passing year. Ethan shook his head, trying to dispel the melancholy that threatened to overtake him. He pushed off from the truck and made his way across the park, his steps measured and deliberate. As he approached, Lily caught sight of him and waved enthusiastically. "Dad, Dad, you're early," she called out, her face flushed with exertion and happiness. Ethan forced a smile, acutely aware of Mr. Harris's gaze upon him. "Hey, Pumpkin, ready to head home?" Lily nodded and turned to say goodbye to her friends. Mr. Harris approached, his hand extended in greeting. "Mr. Thompson, good to see you," he said, his voice warm and friendly. Ethan shook his hand briefly, mumbling a greeting in return. He couldn't help but notice the sadness that lingered in the corners of Mr. Harris's eyes, a testament to his own recent loss. For a moment, Ethan felt a flicker of empathy, but he quickly suppressed it. As they walked to the truck, Lily chattered excitedly about her day. "And then Mr. Harris told us about the time he went camping in the mountains, Dad. He saw bears and everything." Ethan nodded, making appropriate noises of interest while his mind raced. He helped Lily into the truck, his movements automatic as he buckled her in. "He knows so many cool stories," Lily continued, oblivious to her father's inner turmoil. "Can we go camping sometime, Dad? Like Mr. Harris did?" Ethan climbed into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "We'll see, Pumpkin," he said, his voice strained. "We'll see." As they pulled away from the park, Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror. Mr. Harris was still standing there, watching them leave. The sight made Ethan's stomach churn with a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite name. He wanted to trust, to see the good in people as his mother had taught him. But the world seemed darker now, full of shadows and hidden dangers. And as much as he hated to admit it, a part of him resented Mr. Harris for the easy way he connected with Lily, for the excitement he brought into her life. Ethan sighed heavily, earning a curious look from his daughter. He forced another smile, pushing down his conflicting emotions. For now, he would watch and wait, protective instincts warring with the desire to let his daughter experience the world. As they drove home, the late afternoon sun painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Whether for better or worse, he couldn't say. But one thing was certain. He would do whatever it took to keep his daughter safe, even if it meant confronting his own fears and prejudices along the way. The following day, Ethan found himself in the local diner, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He'd arrived early for the regular parents' meetup, his mind churning with questions about Mr. Harris. As other parents trickled in, filling the air with chatter and the clinking of cutlery, Ethan steeled himself for the conversation ahead. "So, what do you all think about Mr. Harris?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his tone casual as the group settled into their usual booth. Sarah, a single mother of twin boys, was the first to respond. "Oh, he's been a godsend," she exclaimed. "My boys were having such a hard time after their dad left, but Mr. Harris has really helped them come out of their shells." Ethan nodded, his brow furrowing slightly. He turned to Mark, a usually taciturn man whose daughter was in Lily's class. "What about you, Mark? Any thoughts?" Mark shrugged, but there was a hint of approval in his voice. "Seems like a decent guy. Ashley's grades have improved since he started that after-school tutoring program." As the conversation continued, Ethan found himself growing increasingly frustrated. Every parent seemed to have nothing but praise for Mr. Harris. They spoke of his dedication, his patience, the way he went above and beyond for the students. It was everything Ethan should have wanted to hear, but instead, it only added to his confusion. Just as he was about to give up, Linda, a notorious gossip, leaned in close. "You know," she said in a conspiratorial whisper, "I heard he was in a real bad way after his wife passed. Barely left the house for months." Ethan's ears perked up at this. "Really?" he probed, trying to keep his voice neutral. Linda nodded emphatically. "Oh yes. Apparently it was quite sudden. Car accident, I think. He was devastated. Some say he took the teaching job as a way to cope with the loss." This information swirled in Ethan's mind, adding another layer to the complex picture of Mr. Harris. He found himself torn between sympathy for the man's loss and a nagging suspicion that there was more to the story. As the meetup wound down, Ethan made his excuses and left, his head buzzing with conflicting thoughts. The crisp autumn air did little to clear his mind as he walked aimlessly through the town streets. Without fully realizing it, his feet had carried him to the park where Lily often played after school. And there, as if summoned by Ethan's troubled thoughts, was Mr. Harris, walking along the path that skirted the edge of the playground. In that moment, Ethan made a decision. He would follow Mr. Harris, observe him when he thought no one was watching. It wasn't something he was proud of, but the need to know, to understand, overrode his usual sense of propriety. Keeping a discreet distance, Ethan trailed Mr. Harris through the park. The teacher moved with a purposeful stride, occasionally stopping to greet a passerby or admire a particularly vibrant autumn leaf. As they neared the lake at the center of the park, Mr. Harris slowed his pace. He found a bench overlooking the water and sat down, his shoulders slumping slightly, as if under an invisible weight. Ethan concealed himself behind a large oak tree, his heart racing. He watched as Mr. Harris pulled something from his pocket, a small, worn photograph. Even from this distance, Ethan could see the gentle way the teacher traced the image with his finger. For a long moment, Mr. Harris sat there, lost in thought or memory. Then, with a deep sigh that Ethan could almost feel in his own chest, he tucked the photo away and stood up. As Mr. Harris resumed his walk, Ethan remained rooted to the spot. The simple, private moment he had witnessed stirred something within him. A grudging recognition of shared pain, perhaps, or the first seeds of doubt about his own suspicions. But even as part of him wanted to call out to Mr. Harris, to acknowledge their common ground, another part held him back. The protective instinct that had driven him this far wasn't so easily silenced. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Ethan finally moved from his hiding spot. He walked home slowly, his mind a tumult of conflicting emotions. The mystery of Mr. Harris hadn't been solved. If anything, it had only deepened. But for the first time, Ethan found himself wondering if perhaps the real mystery wasn't Mr. Harris at all, but rather the fears and insecurities that drove his own suspicions. Arriving home, he found Lily waiting for him, her face alight with excitement about something that had happened at school. As he listened to her chatter, Ethan made a silent promise to himself. He would get to the bottom of this, one way or another. For Lily's sake, and perhaps for his own, he needed to uncover the truth about Mr. Harris, whatever that truth might be. The following weekend, Ethan found himself back at the park, this time with Lily in tow. As they approached the playground, he spotted Mr. Harris surrounded by a group of children, including Lily's classmates. His daughter's eyes lit up at the sight, and before Ethan could say a word, she was running towards the group. "Wait, Lily!" Ethan called out, but his voice was lost in the excited chatter of the children. He hung back, settling on a nearby bench where he could observe without being too conspicuous. The autumn sun was warm on his face, a stark contrast to the chill of uncertainty in his chest. Mr. Harris's voice carried across the playground, clear and animated. "All right, kids, gather round. I've got a story to share with you today." The children quickly formed a semicircle around the teacher, their faces upturned and eager. Ethan found himself leaning forward, straining to hear. "You know," Mr. Harris began, his voice taking on a softer tone, "sometimes life gives us beautiful things, and sometimes it takes them away. But the memories, those are ours to keep forever." Ethan watched as the teacher's hand unconsciously moved to his chest, where Ethan knew he kept that worn photograph. "I want to tell you about someone very special to me," Mr. Harris continued. "My wife, Sarah. She was the kindest, bravest person I've ever known." As Mr. Harris wove his tale, painting a vivid picture of a woman who loved adventure and had a laugh that could light up a room, Ethan found himself drawn in despite his reservations. The children sat in rapt attention, hanging on every word. "Sarah taught me that even when things are tough, there's always something beautiful to be found," Mr. Harris said, his voice thick with emotion. "She would say, 'Look for the flowers growing through the cracks in the sidewalk. They're a reminder that life finds a way, no matter what.'" Ethan glanced at Lily, surprised to see tears glistening in her eyes. She wasn't alone. Many of the children seemed deeply moved by the story. As Mr. Harris concluded his tale, there was a moment of hushed silence. Then, one by one, the children began to share their own stories, of grandparents they missed, of pets they'd lost, of friends who had moved away. Mr. Harris listened to each one with genuine interest, offering words of comfort and understanding. Ethan sat frozen on the bench, a whirlwind of emotions coursing through him. He had come here looking for signs of danger, for reasons to distrust. Instead, he found himself witnessing a moment of profound connection and healing. The cynical part of him wanted to dismiss it all as an act, a calculated move to win the children's trust. But as he watched Mr. Harris console a young boy who was sobbing about his recently deceased dog, Ethan couldn't deny the genuine compassion in the teacher's eyes. As the impromptu sharing session wound down, Ethan saw Lily approach Mr. Harris. She said something he couldn't hear, and the teacher knelt down to her level, listening intently. After a moment, he gave her a gentle pat on the shoulder, and Lily's face broke into a smile. Ethan felt a pang in his chest. When was the last time he had really listened to Lily like that? When had he last shared stories about her mother, keeping her memory alive? As the group began to disperse, Ethan stood up, intending to call Lily over. But before he could, Mr. Harris looked up and their eyes met across the playground. For a brief moment, Ethan saw a flicker of something in the teacher's gaze. Recognition, perhaps, or a silent understanding. Ethan nodded slightly, an unconscious gesture of, what? Respect? Acknowledgement? He wasn't sure. But as he turned away, herding Lily towards home, he felt the first cracks forming in the wall of suspicion he had built around Mr. Harris. That night, as he tucked Lily into bed, she asked, "Dad, can we talk about Mom sometime? Like Mr. Harris talked about his wife?" Ethan felt his throat tighten. "Of course, Pumpkin," he managed to say. "Anytime you want." As he left her room, closing the door softly behind him, Ethan leaned against the wall, overwhelmed by a mixture of guilt and gratitude. He had been so focused on protecting Lily from potential harm that he had neglected to help her process her own loss. Mr. Harris, the man he had been so quick to distrust, had inadvertently opened a door that Ethan had kept firmly shut. And now, standing in the quiet hallway of his home, Ethan realized that perhaps it was time to step through that door himself. The mystery surrounding Mr. Harris was far from solved, but for the first time, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to learn from this man than he had initially thought. And perhaps, in the process of unraveling the enigma of Mr. Harris, Ethan might find a way to heal his own wounded heart. As the weeks passed, Ethan found himself drawn more and more to the park, always under the guise of watching Lily play. In reality, his attention was often fixed on Mr. Harris, observing the teacher's interactions with the children and their parents. On this particular afternoon, the air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the trees stood nearly bare against the gray sky. Ethan watched as Mr. Harris led the children through what had become a regular after-school activity, a nature walk around the park. As the group neared the end of their circuit, Ethan edged closer, driven by a curiosity he couldn't quite explain. Mr. Harris gathered the children around him, their cheeks flushed from the cold and exercise. "All right, everyone," Mr. Harris began, his breath visible in the chilly air. "Before we finish up, I want you to take a moment and look around. What do you see?" The children's responses came quickly. "Dead leaves, gray clouds, bare trees." Mr. Harris nodded, a gentle smile on his face. "You're all right, but let me ask you this. Is that all you see?" There was a moment of confused silence before a small voice piped up. It was Lily. "I see a red berry on that bush over there." "Excellent, Lily," Mr. Harris exclaimed. "Anyone else?" Slowly, other observations trickled in. A patch of green moss on a tree trunk. A bright blue jay perched on a branch. A single yellow flower stubbornly blooming despite the cold. "You see," Mr. Harris continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Life is full of challenges. Sometimes it might feel like everything around us is gray and lifeless. But if we look closely, there's always something beautiful to be found." Ethan found himself leaning in, captivated by the teacher's words. "The most important things in life," Mr. Harris said, "are often the smallest. A kind word from a friend, a moment of laughter, a memory that makes you smile. These are the things that make life worth living, even when times are tough." As he spoke, Ethan noticed a glimmer of moisture in Mr. Harris's eyes. The man's voice wavered slightly as he continued. "I learned this lesson from someone very dear to me, and now I want to pass it on to all of you. Never forget to look for the beauty in the world, even when it seems hidden." The children nodded solemnly, seeming to grasp the weight of his words despite their young age. As they began to disperse, heading towards waiting parents, Ethan remained rooted to the spot, Mr. Harris's words echoing in his mind. He thought about his own life, how he had withdrawn into himself after his wife's death, focusing solely on protecting Lily. Had he forgotten to look for the beauty in the world? Had he been so consumed by fear and suspicion that he'd missed the small joys life had to offer? Lost in thought, Ethan didn't notice Mr. Harris approach until the man was standing right beside him. "Mr. Thompson," the teacher said, startling Ethan out of his reverie. "I hope you don't mind me saying, but I've noticed you here quite often lately." Ethan felt a flush of embarrassment creep up his neck. I just like to keep an eye on Lily," he stammered. Mr. Harris nodded, his eyes kind but knowing. "She's a remarkable girl. You should be proud." "I am," Ethan replied, surprised by the sudden lump in his throat. There was a moment of awkward silence before Mr. Harris spoke again. "You know, Mr. Thompson, I lost my wife 2 years ago. It was the hardest thing I've ever been through." Ethan felt a jolt of surprise at the teacher's openness. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling inadequate. Mr. Harris gave a sad smile. "Thank you. It's been a long journey, but I've learned that sharing my experience can help others who are going through similar pain. And sometimes it helps me too." As Ethan looked into Mr. Harris's eyes, he saw not the potential threat he had imagined, but a man who had known profound loss and found a way to keep living. For the first time, Ethan felt an overwhelming urge to reach out, to connect. But before he could formulate a response, Lily came bounding up, full of excitement about the day's discoveries. The moment passed, and Mr. Harris bid them both goodbye with a friendly wave. As Ethan walked home with Lily, her small hand in his, he felt a shift within himself. The wall of suspicion he had built around Mr. Harris was crumbling, replaced by a tentative respect and a glimmer of understanding. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Ethan made a decision. Tomorrow, he would approach Mr. Harris. He would introduce himself properly, not as a suspicious parent, but as a man willing to open himself to new connections. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him. But as he drifted off to sleep, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Hope that perhaps, in reaching out to understand Mr. Harris, he might find a way to heal his own wounded heart. The next day dawned crisp and clear, a rarity for the season. Ethan found himself at the park earlier than usual, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. He spotted Mr. Harris near the playground, helping a young boy tie his shoelaces. Taking a deep breath, Ethan approached. "Mr. Harris?" he called out, his voice steadier than he felt. The teacher looked up, surprise flickering across his face before being replaced by a warm smile. "Mr. Thompson, good morning," he said, straightening up. "Please, call me Ethan," he replied, extending his hand. Mr. Harris shook it firmly. "John," the teacher offered in return. "It's good to finally talk properly." There was a moment of awkward silence before Ethan cleared his throat. I wanted to thank you for what you said yesterday about finding beauty in small things. It really struck a chord with me." John's eyes softened. "I'm glad to hear that, Ethan. It's a lesson I'm still learning myself, to be honest." Ethan nodded, feeling a sudden urge to open up. "I lost my wife, Sarah, 3 years ago," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "Cancer. It happened so fast, and I guess I've been struggling ever since." John's expression was one of deep understanding. "I'm so sorry, Ethan. Losing a spouse, it changes everything, doesn't it?" "Yeah," Ethan agreed, surprised by how easy it felt to talk about this with John. "How do you do it? How do you keep going and stay so positive?" John smiled, but there was a sadness in his eyes. "It's not easy. There are still days when the grief feels overwhelming. But I found that focusing on others, on making a difference in their lives, helps me find purpose." He paused, looking out over the playground. "Teaching these kids, sharing what I've learned, it's my way of honoring Maria's memory. She was a teacher too, you know. She always said that every child deserves someone who believes in them." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. That's beautiful, John. I wish I had your strength." John turned back to him, his gaze intense. "You do have strength, Ethan. You're here, aren't you? You're raising Lily on your own, protecting her. That takes incredible strength." Ethan blinked, taken aback by John's words. He had never thought of his overprotectiveness as a form of strength before. "But," John continued gently, "sometimes the bravest thing we can do is open ourselves up to new connections, new experiences. It's scary, but it's also how we heal." As they continued to talk, Ethan found himself sharing more about Sarah, about his fears for Lily, about the loneliness he'd been feeling. John listened attentively, offering words of understanding and encouragement. In turn, John opened up about his own journey through grief, about the dark days following Maria's death, and how he had slowly found his way back to life. He spoke of the financial struggles he'd faced, of downsizing his home and taking on extra tutoring jobs to make ends meet. "It's been tough," John admitted, "but I've learned that wealth isn't just about money. The connections we make, the lives we touch, that's the real richness in life." As their conversation drew to a close, Ethan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt truly understood. "Thank you, John," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything. I misjudged you, and I'm sorry for that." John smiled, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "No apologies necessary, Ethan. We're all just trying to navigate this crazy journey called life. Sometimes we need a little help along the way." As they parted ways, Ethan watched John return to the group of children, his manner warm and engaging. He felt a twinge of regret for the time he had wasted being suspicious, but it was overshadowed by a growing sense of hope. Walking home, Ethan's mind raced with possibilities. Maybe he could volunteer at the school, or help John with his tutoring program. Perhaps it was time to start living again, not just existing. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a spark of excitement for the future. He had set out to uncover the truth about John Harris, and in doing so, he had discovered something far more valuable: a potential friend, a kindred spirit, and a new perspective on life. As he reached his front door, Ethan made a silent promise to himself and to Sarah's memory. He would try to embrace life again, to find the beauty in small moments, and to be the kind of father and person that Sarah would have been proud of. The mystery of John Harris had been solved, but Ethan's journey was just beginning. And for the first time in a long time, he was looking forward to where it might lead. A few weeks after his heartfelt conversation with John, Ethan found himself sitting in the school gymnasium, surrounded by other parents at the monthly PTA meeting. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and the low hum of conversation. Ethan fidgeted in his seat, gathering his courage for what he was about to propose. As the meeting progressed through its usual agenda, Ethan's mind wandered to the struggles John had hinted at during their talk. The image of the dedicated teacher working extra hours to make ends meet had stayed with him, gnawing at his conscience. Finally, as the meeting was drawing to a close, Ethan raised his hand. "I'd like to propose something if I may," he said, his voice slightly shaky but determined. The PTA president, Mrs. Gonzalez, nodded encouragingly. "Go ahead, Mr. Thompson." Ethan stood, feeling all eyes turned to him. "I think we should organize a community event to support Mr. Harris," he began, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "Many of us know he's been going through a tough time since losing his wife, and he's done so much for our kids. I was thinking maybe a fundraiser or a appreciation day." A murmur of interest rippled through the crowd. Sarah, the mother of the twins, was the first to speak up. "That's a wonderful idea, Ethan. Mr. Harris has been such a positive influence on my boys. I'd be happy to help organize something." Several other parents nodded in agreement, offering suggestions and volunteering their time. Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him as the idea gained traction. However, not everyone was immediately on board. Mark, the usually quiet father, cleared his throat. "I appreciate what you're saying, Ethan, but do we really know enough about Mr. Harris's situation? It seems a bit personal." Linda, the town gossip, chimed in. "I heard he's been spending a lot of time with the kids outside of school hours. Don't you think that's a bit odd?" Ethan felt a flicker of his old suspicions, but he pushed them aside. "I've spoken with Mr. Harris myself," he said firmly. "He's a good man who's been through a lot. The time he spends with the kids is his way of coping and giving back to the community. I think that's something we should support, not question." Mrs. Gonzalez nodded thoughtfully. "I agree with Ethan. Mr. Harris has been an asset to our school. If we can help him out while bringing the community together, I think that's a win-win situation." As the meeting concluded, a committee was formed to plan the event, with Ethan at the helm. As he gathered his things to leave, several parents approached him, offering their support and ideas. Walking to his car, Ethan felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. He was proud of himself for speaking up, for taking a step towards not just helping John, but also reconnecting with his community. Yet, a small part of him still worried. What if he was wrong about John? What if there was more to the story? As he drove home, Ethan's mind raced with conflicting thoughts. He remembered the sincerity in John's eyes when they had talked, the way the man's face lit up when he spoke about teaching. But he also couldn't shake the memory of his own pain, the fear of being vulnerable again. Pulling into his driveway, Ethan saw Lily waiting on the porch, her face breaking into a smile as she spotted him. As he hugged her, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, Ethan made a decision. He would move forward with the event, choosing to trust in the goodness he had seen in John. That night, as he lay in bed, Ethan felt a strange mix of emotions. There was anticipation for the upcoming event, pride in taking action, and a lingering thread of doubt that he couldn't quite shake. But underneath it all was a growing sense of purpose, a feeling that perhaps, in helping John, he was also finding a way to help himself. As he drifted off to sleep, Ethan's last thoughts were of the community coming together, of new friendships forming, and of the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he was finally on the path to healing. The weeks leading up to the community event for John Harris were a whirlwind of activity. Ethan found himself at the center of it all, coordinating volunteers, securing donations, and ironing out logistical details. The event had grown from a simple appreciation day into a full-fledged community fair, complete with food stalls, games, and a silent auction to raise funds for the school's tutoring program. As the day of the event approached, Ethan's excitement was tinged with a persistent undercurrent of anxiety. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was exposing himself, making himself vulnerable in a way he hadn't since Sarah's death. And beneath it all, a small voice of doubt continued to whisper questions about John's true nature. The morning of the event dawned bright and clear. Ethan arrived at the school grounds early, his truck loaded with supplies. As he began setting up, he saw John approaching, a look of bewilderment on his face. "Ethan," John called out, "what's all this?" Ethan felt a moment of panic. In all the planning, he had neglected to inform John about the event. It's for you, John," he stammered. "A community appreciation day, to thank you for everything you've done for the kids." John's eyes widened in surprise, then filled with emotion. I don't know what to say," he murmured, clearly overwhelmed. As other volunteers arrived and the setup continued, Ethan found himself working side by side with John. They chatted easily, sharing stories and laughs. Ethan was struck by how natural it felt, how the lingering doubts seemed to fade in the face of John's genuine warmth and humility. As the event kicked into full swing, Ethan watched with a sense of pride as the community came together. Children laughed as they played games, parents chatted over cups of coffee, and a sense of joy permeated the air. John moved through the crowd, greeting everyone with a smile, his face alight with gratitude. Midway through the day, Mrs. Gonzalez took the stage to make an announcement. "Thanks to your generosity," she beamed, "we've raised enough money to not only support our tutoring program, but also to establish a scholarship fund in honor of Maria Harris to help underprivileged children in our community." The crowd erupted in applause. Ethan turned to John, only to find the man wiping tears from his eyes. This is incredible," John said, his voice choked with emotion. "Maria would have loved this. Thank you, Ethan. Thank you all." As the day wore on, Ethan found himself relaxing, truly enjoying himself for the first time in years. He watched Lily as she played with her friends, her laughter carrying across the schoolyard. It was a sound he realized he hadn't heard nearly enough lately. As the event wound down and the cleanup began, Ethan felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find John standing there, a serious expression on his face. "Ethan, can we talk for a moment?" John asked, gesturing towards a quiet corner of the schoolyard. Ethan nodded, feeling a sudden rush of anxiety. Had he overstepped? Was John upset about the event? As they moved away from the crowd, John took a deep breath. "Ethan, I can't thank you enough for all of this. But there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have mentioned before." Ethan's heart raced. This was it, he thought. The other shoe was about to drop. John continued, his voice low and serious. "I've been offered a position at a private school in the city. It's a great opportunity, better pay, more resources. I've been struggling with the decision for weeks now." Ethan felt a pang of disappointment, mixed with a strange sense of relief. Was this the secret he had been fearing? "Are you going to take it?" he asked. John shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "No. After today, how could I? This community, these kids, this is where I belong. Where Maria and I belonged. I can't walk away from that." As John's words sank in, Ethan felt a wave of emotions wash over him. Relief, joy, and a profound sense of connection. He realized that in organizing this event, in opening himself up to John and the community, he had taken a crucial step in his own healing journey. As they walked back to join the others, Ethan felt lighter than he had in years. The doubts and fears that had plagued him for so long seemed to have melted away, replaced by a sense of belonging and purpose. The mystery of John Harris had been solved, but not in the way Ethan had initially expected. Instead of uncovering a hidden threat, he had discovered a true friend, a supportive community, and a new chapter in his own life. As the sun set on the day's events, Ethan looked around at the smiling faces of his neighbors, at Lily laughing with her friends, and at John, standing tall and proud amidst the community that had embraced him. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt truly at home. As the weeks passed following the successful community event, Ethan found himself settling into a new rhythm of life. The walls he had built around himself and Lily were slowly coming down, allowing new connections to form and old ones to strengthen. One crisp Saturday afternoon, the town square was bustling with activity for the annual Harvest Festival. Colorful banners hung between lampposts, the air filled with the scent of cinnamon and the sound of lively music. Ethan and Lily made their way through the crowd, taking in the sights and sounds. "Dad, look!" Lily exclaimed, pointing towards a makeshift dance floor where couples were swaying to the music. "Can we go dance?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, memories of dancing with Sarah at this very festival years ago flooding his mind. But as he looked down at Lily's eager face, he felt a surge of warmth in his chest. "Sure thing, Pumpkin," he said with a smile. As they approached the dance floor, Ethan caught sight of John, who was chatting animatedly with a group of students near the punch bowl. Their eyes met, and John gave a friendly wave before turning back to his conversation. Ethan and Lily joined the dancers, with Lily standing on her father's feet as they swayed to the music. As they twirled and laughed, Ethan felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. He looked down at Lily, her face beaming with joy, and felt a surge of love and gratitude. "You know, your mom loved to dance," Ethan said softly, surprising himself with the ease of bringing up Sarah. Lily's eyes widened. "Really? Was she good at it?" Ethan chuckled. "Oh, she was terrible. But she didn't care. She always said it was about the joy of moving, not about looking good." As they continued to dance, Ethan shared more memories of Sarah, each one feeling like a weight lifting off his shoulders. Lily listened intently, her eyes shining with a mix of curiosity and happiness. As the song ended, Ethan noticed John standing nearby, a warm smile on his face. "Mind if I cut in?" John asked, extending his hand to Lily. Lily looked up at Ethan, seeking permission. With a nod and a smile, Ethan stepped back, watching as John led Lily in a goofy, exaggerated dance that had her giggling uncontrollably. As he observed them, Ethan felt a complex mix of emotions. There was a twinge of the old protectiveness, but it was overshadowed by a profound sense of gratitude. John had become not just a friend, but a positive male influence in Lily's life, something Ethan realized she had been missing. The festival continued into the evening, with Ethan, Lily, and John enjoying the various activities together. They sampled pies at the baking contest, cheered on the participants in the pumpkin carving competition, and laughed at each other's attempts at the ring toss game. As the night drew to a close, fireworks began to light up the sky. The crowd gathered in the town square, faces turned upward in awe. Ethan felt a small hand slip into his and looked down to see Lily, her eyes reflecting the colorful bursts above. On Lily's other side stood John, who caught Ethan's eye and gave a nod of understanding. In that moment, Ethan felt a sense of peace wash over him. He realized that the family he and Lily had lost wasn't being replaced, but rather, it was expanding in new and unexpected ways. As the final fireworks faded and the crowd began to disperse, Ethan, Lily, and John walked together towards the parking lot. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by Lily's excited recounting of her favorite parts of the day. Before they parted ways, John turned to Ethan. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice filled with sincerity. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "For what?" John smiled. "For trusting me, for letting me be a part of your lives. It means more than you know." As they said their goodbyes and headed home, Ethan reflected on the journey of the past few months, from suspicion and fear to trust and friendship, from isolation to community. The change wasn't just in his relationship with John, but in his entire outlook on life. That night, as he tucked Lily into bed, she asked sleepily, "Dad, can Mr. Harris come to our house for dinner sometime?" Ethan smiled, running a hand over her hair. "I think that's a great idea, Pumpkin. We'll ask him soon." As he closed Lily's door and walked to his own room, Ethan felt a sense of anticipation for the future. The world seemed fuller, richer, more colorful than it had in years. And while the pain of loss would always be a part of him, he now understood that it didn't have to define him. With a contented sigh, Ethan climbed into bed, looking forward to what tomorrow might bring. The mystery of John Harris had led him on an unexpected journey of self-discovery and healing, one that was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, Ethan was excited to see where the path might lead. As autumn gave way to winter, Ethan found himself increasingly involved in community activities, often alongside John. The dinner Lily had suggested became a regular occurrence, with John joining them every other Friday for a meal and conversation that often stretched late into the evening. One chilly Saturday morning, Ethan arrived at the local community center, where John had invited him to help with a charity project. As he entered the bustling hall, he was greeted by the sight of John surrounded by a group of children, all wearing matching t-shirts with Hope Builders printed on the back. "Ethan," John called out, waving him over. "Glad you could make it. Let me introduce you to our little team here." As John introduced each child, Ethan noticed that they all seemed to come from diverse backgrounds. Some wore clothes that had seen better days, while others spoke with accents suggesting they were new to the country. "What's all this about, John?" Ethan asked, both curious and impressed. John's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "This is a project I started in Maria's memory," he explained. "We work with underprivileged kids and those new to our community, helping them feel welcomed and supported." As John went on to describe the various initiatives, from tutoring sessions to cultural exchange programs, Ethan felt a growing sense of admiration. This was far more extensive than he had imagined. That's incredible, John," Ethan said, genuinely moved. "How long have you been doing this?" "About a year now," John replied. "It started small, just me and a couple of kids from school, but it's grown quite a bit. Maria always believed in the power of education and community to change lives. This is my way of carrying on her legacy." Throughout the day, Ethan worked alongside John and the children, helping to organize donations, prepare care packages, and even assist with English lessons for some of the newer arrivals. The energy and positivity in the room were contagious, and Ethan found himself thoroughly enjoying the experience. During a quiet moment, as they were sorting through a box of donated books, Ethan turned to John. "You know, I never realized how much you do for this community," he said. "It's truly inspiring." John smiled, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "After Maria died, I felt so lost, but then I remembered something she always used to say. When you're feeling broken, help put someone else back together. This project, it's helped me as much as it's helped these kids." Ethan nodded, understanding all too well the healing power of helping others. "I'd like to get more involved," he found himself saying. "If you'll have me, that is." John's face broke into a wide grin. "Are you kidding? We'd be thrilled to have you on board." As they continued their work, Ethan's mind was already racing with ideas. His skills as a mechanic could be put to use teaching basic car maintenance to older teens. Maybe he could even offer internships at his shop. When Lily came to pick him up at the end of the day, she had insisted on coming along when she heard where he was going. Her eyes widened at the sight of all the activity. "Dad, this is so cool," she exclaimed. "Can I help next time?" Ethan exchanged a glance with John, who nodded encouragingly. "Of course you can, Pumpkin," Ethan replied, feeling a surge of pride. "In fact, why don't we make it a regular thing? Every Saturday?" Lily's enthusiastic response was all the answer he needed. As they were leaving, John pulled Ethan aside. "Thank you for today," he said. "And for everything, really. You know, when I first came to this town after Maria died, I never expected to find, well, family." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. "I know exactly what you mean," he managed to say. Driving home with Lily, chattering excitedly about all the ways she wanted to help, Ethan felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. He had set out months ago to uncover the truth about John Harris, suspecting some hidden agenda. Instead, he had discovered a kindred spirit, a project that could make a real difference and a new direction for his own life. That night, as he lay in bed, Ethan found himself thinking of Sarah. For the first time in a long while, the memories brought more comfort than pain. He could almost hear her voice, encouraging him to embrace this new chapter in his life. With a smile, Ethan closed his eyes, looking forward to the adventures that lay ahead. The mystery of John Harris had led him down an unexpected path, one that promised not just healing for himself and Lily, but the chance to make a real difference in his community. And for that, Ethan was profoundly grateful. As winter melted into spring, Ethan's involvement in John's charity project, now officially named Hope Builders, had become a central part of his life. He and Lily spent most Saturdays at the community center, working alongside John and the growing number of volunteers. Ethan's auto shop had become a hub for teaching basic mechanics to interested teens, and he had even taken on a couple of apprentices. One ordinary Tuesday afternoon, as Ethan was closing up his shop, his phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. "Hello, is this Ethan Thompson?" a formal voice inquired when he answered. "Yes, this is he," Ethan replied, curiosity piqued. "Mr. Thompson, my name is Richard Hawthorne. I'm an attorney representing the estate of Maria Harris. I was wondering if you might be available for a meeting tomorrow afternoon. It's regarding a matter of some importance concerning John Harris." Ethan felt a flutter of anxiety in his stomach. "Is John okay?" he asked, his mind racing with possibilities. "Oh, yes, Mr. Harris is fine," the lawyer assured him. "This is more of a financial matter. I'm afraid I can't say more over the phone, but I assure you it's nothing to worry about." After agreeing to the meeting, Ethan hung up, his mind swirling with questions. He debated calling John, but decided against it, not wanting to worry him unnecessarily. The next day, Ethan found himself in a plush office downtown, facing Mr. Hawthorne across a large mahogany desk. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Thompson," the lawyer began. "I'll get straight to the point. Are you aware that Maria Harris came from a wealthy family?" Ethan shook his head, stunned. "No, I had no idea. John never mentioned it." Mr. Hawthorne nodded. "I suspected as much. You see, Maria's family had a rather substantial fortune. When she married John, there was some discord. Her parents didn't approve of her marrying a teacher. As a result, Maria chose to live modestly with John, keeping her inheritance a secret from him." Ethan listened, his shock growing with each word. Unfortunately, Maria passed away before she could tell John about her inheritance. Her will stipulated that the fortune should go to John, but only after a period of 5 years had passed since her death. That time has now elapsed. The lawyer paused, allowing the information to sink in. "Mr. Thompson, John Harris is now the heir to a fortune worth approximately $50 million. Ethan felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. "50 million, he stammered. Mr. Hawthorne nodded solemnly. "Yes, and here's where you come in, Mr. Thompson. Maria's will also specified that before John could be informed of his inheritance, a trusted individual should be consulted to verify John's character. Your name was provided to us by the school board as someone who knows John well. We need your assurance that this sudden wealth won't negatively impact John or the community he serves." Ethan's mind raced. He thought of John's dedication to teaching, his tireless work with Hope Builders, the modest life he led despite the opportunities he'd had to leave for higher-paying jobs. "Mr. Hawthorne," Ethan said, his voice filled with conviction, "I can assure you that John Harris is one of the finest men I know. This money, it won't change who he is. If anything, it will allow him to help even more people." The lawyer smiled, seemingly satisfied. "That's exactly what we hope to hear. Now, we need to discuss how to break this news to John." Later that evening, Ethan found himself sitting across from John at their favorite local diner. John had just finished telling a funny story about one of his students when Ethan cleared his throat. "John, there's something I need to tell you," he began, his heart racing. As Ethan relayed the information from the lawyer, he watched a myriad of emotions play across John's face: shock, disbelief, and finally, a kind of quiet awe. I don't know what to say," John finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan reached across the table, placing a hand on his friend's arm. "You don't have to say anything. Just know that this doesn't change who you are, John. It just means you can do even more good in the world." John nodded slowly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Maria," he murmured. "She always was full of surprises." As they sat there, The magnitude of the revelation settling over them, Ethan felt a profound sense of rightness. The journey that had begun with suspicion and fear had led to this moment of trust and new beginnings. "So," Ethan said, a smile playing on his lips, "any ideas on how we're going to put this money to good use?" John looked up, a familiar spark of enthusiasm returning to his eyes. "You know," he said, "I've always dreamed of starting a proper community center with resources for education, job training, childcare." As John began to outline his vision, his excitement growing with each idea, Ethan sat back and listened, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. The mystery of John Harris had finally been solved, but the adventure was far from over. In fact, Ethan realized it was only just beginning. And as they talked late into the night, planning and dreaming, Ethan knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, not just as friends, but as family.